Good evening and welcome back to day two of the Cystic Fibrosis Annual Conference for 2022. Thank you so much to everyone that participated yesterday, and indeed welcome back to everyone this evening. It's fantastic that we've got such great content to bring to you again this evening, and yesterday was so jam-packed, so many key takeaways from Professor Barry Plant, from Professor Paul McNally, and indeed, of course, from our panelist interviews from Rory Talon, from Clare, and from Brian. So some great insights, some great stories, and some great moments of positivity and some great momentum that we're building in the community. Tonight, we have a different turn of events, and we have a number of different focus topics. Starting this evening, a really interesting conversation and a panel discussion focusing really around the importance of exercise. And it's of such great passion to me. Every morning when I wake up and I speak to my son Senan, who's 8 now and lives with cystic fibrosis, I talk to him about the importance of exercise, the importance of movement, the importance of him getting out and about and really being active. It's a pivotal part of him living with his cystic fibrosis. So really looking forward to that session. Then we'll have a little bit of a session with Sam and go through all of the member services that are available. And later on then in the evening session, we'll be taking a different spin again and looking at really the changing differing therapies that are available to us, and some really insightful concepts that are going to be brought to us. I'm going to not try and pronounce the names incorrectly, but I can definitely pronounce Dr. Sarah Tecklenburg and Dr. Patrick Harrison, who are going to talk to us around gene editing and gene therapies. And then later on, Professor Koers van der Ent is going to be with us to talk about the HIT-CF project, joined by our Vice Chair, Patricia Duffy-Barber, on that session. So lots to get in and lots to get through. We spoke yesterday, and I'll intro this session, I guess, back with the whole sporting analogy, and exercise is a pivotal part, and people would typically deem sport, but sport can be any sense of movement. And we, again, are thinking back to the incremental gains. We spoke yesterday around Dr. David Brailsford and how he improved the British cycling team. I'll speak as someone that's closer to home to me, who is a footballer, Gary Neville, who really talked about his career and his mentors, who talked about him focusing on being ambitious. And that's the theme of our conference this year, being ambitious with our CF care. Gary was ambitious as a junior footballer to get into the Manchester United first team. He then went on and made his 100 appearances for the club. And he then went on and went to win a number of Premier Leagues, Champions Leagues, and FA Cups. And I think the message behind the story of Gary was he went back to his mentors every time, who told him to continue to change his ambition, to continue to stretch for the next goal, to set that next target for himself. And that's someone who was one of the most decorated English footballers, and I do happen to be a Manchester United fan. So the concept tonight, when we listen now to our fantastic panel with Clare, with Chris, and with Caroline, we want to hear around what they've been doing and how exercise has formed such a pivotal part in their lives, obviously with Clare working in the space. So without further ado, I'll welcome on board our panel discussion this evening. And we're honoured, as I mentioned, to have Clare Reilly, who's a senior physiotherapist in St. Vincent's Hospital here in Dublin. You're very welcome, Clare, and thanks for joining us. We've got Chris Coburn, who has a number of different titles, but he's the current strength and conditioning coach in St. Patrick's Athletic, I believe, Chris, if I've not got that incorrect. And of course, then Caroline Heffernan. Caroline, not stranger to many people who have been on a number of our conferences. Caroline is one of our CF advocate teams here at Cystic Fibrosis Ireland, but does also call herself an endurance athlete. So it'd be good to hear Caroline's spin on that. So you're all really welcome, and a pleasure to have you all this evening. And Clare, thanks so much. I think we're starting with you. So if you'd like to introduce yourself to the audience, and you're welcome, and thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Keith. And thank you very much to the association for asking me. It's an honour to be asked. And I'm here live this evening from the exercise testing room in St. Vincent's Hospital. So for those of you who know me, thank you for staying tuned. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm Clare. I'm a CF physio in St. Vincent's here for the last 21 years, I think, which seems like an awful long time. And I'm going to talk a little bit about exercise. And you might learn a bit about me on the way around as well. So let me see if I share this screen. Technology not being my strong point. Sorry. And play. Oh no. Oh, no, of course it's with that. There we go. Now, yeah, you know who I am, right? So I'm going to move on. And the first thing I've put up today is a little bit about what you see when you look at me in clinic, and probably a little bit about if you went on social media, this is what you see in social media. And I have an awful worry around our use of social media, and I think it projects often an image that's unattainable, makes exercise seem something that you can't attain because you can't do these things. And so what do you see in this shot? What do you see when you see me in clinic? Well, you see, this is a snapshot, a dangerous one if you ask me. You think I'm a physio, I probably exercised all my life. In these images projected here, you see somebody. I couldn't get a picture of me doing judo, but I was an underage UK champion, under 48 kilos. What you see here is I was a national bronze medal middle distance triathlete. I married a very active guy who now runs in an Irish Vest. I have 2 very active kids. Or so it would seem, and all my friends are probably really active too. And I talk a lot to students about this when we talk about exercise prescription, that we live in an echo chamber as physiotherapists. All our friends exercise. We're all really high achieving exercise people, and often we don't see the barriers to exercise. And I don't know what it's like to have cystic fibrosis, and I'll put my hand up and say that. But I've been working here quite a while, and I've seen quite a lot of the barriers to exercise, and I'm hoping I'm going to address some of those in the talk today. And just making sure that as a physio, when we talk about exercise, we need to achieve a balance about how we project exercise, how important it is, and also how we fit it in, and all of those things. So I'm going to come back to the slide at the end, and at the end you'll maybe see a different picture. So the really big thing for me is that exercise is for everybody. It is actually something that if you're sitting listening to me today, as a parent, you should be exercising. As a grandparent, you should be exercising. As a sibling, you should be exercising. And if you've got cystic fibrosis, you probably should be exercising too. But if you're looking for guidance around what you do from an exercise point of view, where we go for it is the WHO, right, the World Health Organization. And they have very clear guidelines about what is required for healthy living in the whole population. I'm going to talk about the whole population as a whole here, because I really believe that exercise is for everybody. And I don't want to encompass exercise within disease, because when you exercise, it's not about having cystic fibrosis. You shouldn't be doing it for your cystic fibrosis. You should be doing it because that's what it is to be healthy. And that's what I want you to come out of this feeling or thinking. So the WHO have very clear guidelines around exercise, and the first one here is for children aged 5 to 17. Now, disclaimer, I'm not a paediatric physio, but I have talked a little bit about peds here, and if you've got big questions at the end, I'll see what I can do about that. But children and adolescents aged 5 to 17 should do at least 60 minutes per day of moderate to vigorous intensity, mostly aerobic, physical activity across the week. So every single day, 60 minutes. This is quite an achievement, I think, especially when they're in school for so long. Then also, children and adolescents should limit their time in sedentary, and particularly in the amount of recreational screen time. This is another thing that comes out from the WHO. And why are these guidelines out there? Well, the following healthcare outcomes come from people and children who are active. They've improved physical fitness, cardiovascular and muscle strength. They've improved cardiometabolic health, and when we talk about that, we're talking about blood pressure, glucose control, insulin sensitivity. They have improved bone health when they're exercising, but they have also improved cognitive outcomes, which is super important, and they also have improved mental health, which is also super important. Then you move on to adults. This is my area of expertise, apparently, and I'm going to talk about 18 to 64. It changes a little bit after 64, but I'll leave that for another day. But adults aged 18 to 64, now I would have told you this in clinic if you've met me, that adults should do at least 150 to 300 minutes of moderate intensity aerobic physical activity, or at least 75 to 150 minutes of vigorous intensity aerobic activity a week. Now that is a huge amount of time as well. I'm not going to underplay that. That is a lot of time to spend in exercise. And when we're talking about moderate to vigorous intensity, moderate intensity means you can't eat an ice cream and walk. Right? That's one of my big bugbears. When you're doing moderate intensity exercise, you know you're exercising. Okay, you should be moderately breathless. And when you're doing vigorous intensity exercise, you should be vigorously active and be quite breathless, or about 15, 16 on a Borg scale of 20, which you hear me talk about when you're in clinic as well. But for additional health benefits, we should also include muscle strengthening at moderate or greater intensity that involves all major muscle groups, not just your arms, not just your legs, but all major muscle groups. And that itself has huge implications as we age. There's a lot of problems around a loss of muscle bulk as we age and as we get frailer. And to prevent that or to offset that, strength training should be happening in every adult at least 2 days of the week. Adults should also limit their time spent being sedentary and replacing this with physical activity of any intensity. Now, what that means is if you are not making your 150 to 300 minutes a week, every minute of activity counts. And that's what I want to take home from today as well. And I'll go into a little bit of the right research later on that also reinforces that point. But these rather large goals that the WHO have set for us seem a little intimidating, but remember that every minute counts. Every minute you're not in the chair, watching TV, playing Game Boy, or whatever it is now. I'm sure it's come a long, long way since Game Boys, but whatever you're doing, every minute counts above zero. And that's really important to remember too. Now, bringing this through to your cystic fibrosis, really what has this got to do with cystic fibrosis? We know the WHO tells me to be healthy, I have to do all these things, but I want to know about my CF. And I'm going to talk science here for a few slides, like the L'Oreal ad. But I was invited to be a member of the Exeter Activity Unlimited International Consensus Conference 2021. So what that means is a group of 30 apparently experts, that's what they call me anyway, got together from all over the world. They did a massive, we were all divided into subsets of topics, and we did this massive meta-analysis of all the research that's happened in exercise. And they came away with a number of statements that we could say with a great confidence was true about exercise and cystic fibrosis. And the first big statement, I think, is physical activity and exercise contribute to increased survival in people with cystic fibrosis. Now, I know and I'm aware that survival can be a loaded concept, especially in the context of chronic illness or disability. And but ultimately, I feel when patients are asking me about exercise, this is kind of what they're asking me. I'm going to live longer if I'm going to do this. And what I would say is everybody's going to live longer if they exercise, because we know, because WHO has told us, that exercise leads to better healthcare outcomes. And exercise in all populations, whether they have chronic illness or not, will increase their survival and reduce the morbidity, because it's really important to live a long life, but it's also really important to live a long life healthily and not to have morbid outcomes. So the other big statement that we came across at this study was engagement in physical activity and exercise has the potential, I like that word, to positively influence the costs associated with hospitalization, exacerbation, and antibiotic use. Well, healthcare cost, I'm quite sure sitting here, you don't really care how much your healthcare costs. And that's probably our privilege because of the healthcare system in which we inhabit. We're very lucky that our healthcare system needs are met by our taxpayer. However, that's not so much for our American and other nationalities. And we were all involved in the study, so that's why this statement did come out, because it came from all over the world. But if you look at costs differently, if you look at the number of hospital days you spend, the frequency of your antibiotic use, the statement has increased value. Because imagine if you got to spend less time in hospital, or you required less antibiotics in a year, or you even got to see me a bit less. That's probably a good healthcare outcome as it stands. So how does these two statements marry? Like how do we achieve this increased survival? How do we achieve this reduced antibiotic use, this reduced hospitalization? Well, we achieve it through the following statements. Now, the first statement there is physical activity may slow the rate of decline in lung function in people with cystic fibrosis, and that was my topic for the research. And I looked at all the research that's ever happened in lung function and FEV1. And what I really want to find, which is what everyone asks me in clinic, is if I exercise, will my lung function go up? I'm sorry to tell you, no, it won't. Okay, but what exercise may do is reduce the slope, reduce the rate in which your lung function declines, and that is great. Physical activity and exercise can improve cardiovascular health in people with cystic fibrosis. However, research is limited. Now, we couldn't make a very strong statement here, but we know that in populations outside cystic fibrosis, physical activity will improve cardiovascular health. We didn't have enough evidence to come up with a strong statement here, but we can say that it can improve cardiovascular health. Resistance training improves limb strength in people with cystic fibrosis. This is true. Okay, but what I would say is when we talk about resistance training, we're talking about strength training. It's just a fancier word, strength training, and it requires a stimulus. It requires a stimulus that's repeated over time. And I would say all the members of my panel here today are much better to talk to you about this. But what I would say about resistance training has so many good benefits around bone health and preservation of muscle, prevention of sarcopenia and frailty as we age. But it requires a repeated stimulus, and that's what patients find really difficult. It's doing the same thing every week in order to increase muscle size or muscle strength. The next statement is exercise of adequate frequency and progressive intensity improves fitness and cystic fibrosis. That probably leads into the previous two statements, that whenever we talk about exercise, it needs to be at adequate frequency. You need to do it enough times per week, or that dose response is what we're looking for, and a progressive intensity. So when something gets easier, you have to make it harder. When your walk gets too easy and you start eating ice cream, you need to stop eating ice cream and walk faster. Introduce hills. You'll have heard me talk about this in clinic. And finally, improved glycemic control and moderate inflammation associated with muscle insulin sensitivity. That sounds very fancy, but what it's telling you there is that, I actually read a study about this last night in peds, that they know that people with cystic fibrosis and CF-related diabetes together don't have a high cardiovascular fitness. All right, and we're not entirely sure why. And I think that's a really hot topic for research. And we know that people with cystic fibrosis, this population is aging. And thank God for modular drugs, it's going to age even more. But with age will come disease complexity. And one of those big complexes, 1/3 of adults with cystic fibrosis do develop diabetes. And we are going to see an influx in this diabetic inflammation that reduces their ability to reach peak oxygen uptake or to be cardiovascular fitter. And what we need to do is prevent that. So one of the ways of doing that is regular exercise, frequently, at a moderate intensity, progressively, etc., etc. And what the statement I haven't put up here is that currently we have very little evidence about the impact of physical activity and exercise on mental health, depression, and anxiety. And that's not to say that there isn't really good positive benefits from exercise in all those three areas. We just didn't have enough research to say it. And we as human beings know that exercise can affect these three areas, and these are really important going forward, that research and funding is pumped into those areas of benefit. And then we start measuring healthcare outcome differently when it comes to exercise, and we look beyond FEV1, beyond limb strength, and into how it helps with mental health and anxiety. So what's the next thing I was going to say? This is a great slide. What is dose response? So what is the dose required of exercise? And we all know that when we're taking our Toby nebs, we have to take them twice a day, or your Toby inhaler, to get a certain dose response. And I think that this is the question I ask all the time when it comes to things. How much do I have to take in order to get what I want out of this? What's the minimum amount of exercise I have to do in order to get a dose response? And this is a question that no one's been able to answer so far. Except I was at a conference 2 weeks ago. I organised this conference in the UK 2 weeks ago, and I asked one of the speakers, Professor Eleanor Main from University College London, who did a fantastic study called Physio, F-I-Z-Z-Y-O. I'm sure it's a funny play on the name, where they looked in paediatrics now. So it's a little bit outside my usual area, but they looked at different habitual airway clearance and physical activity patterns and the impact they had on clinical outcomes in children and young adults in cystic fibrosis. So what they did is they took Fitbit data, and they measured their airway clearance quality and quantity using these devices on their acapellas and things like that. And it was part of the James Lind Alliance in the UK. And what they looked at, the time spent in moderate and vigorous physical activity. Now we know, because you've heard the slide 3 or 4 slides ago, that we need at least 60 minutes per day at threshold in this population. But what they showed when they studied all of these kids, and I can't remember exactly how many kids recruited the study, but it was thousands, that they were not achieving this. So large numbers were not achieving even 30 minutes per day in moderate to vigorous physical activity. So that's a bit of a concern, isn't it? But they looked again, and they showed that any moderate to vigorous physical activity had a significant effect on FEV1. So even when the weekly requirement wasn't being met, that they were having an association with kids that did more had a higher FEV1. Now that's really interesting. And what they did then is they took all the confounders out of that. So they took all the data, looked at disease severity, whether or not they were on a modulator, whether or not they had whether they were older or younger, and how many IVs they had. And when they took all of that data out, took all the confining data out, they could still find that moderate intensity to vigorous intensity physical activity still had a significant effect on FV1. So what was the minimum amount they had to do? Well, it showed there in their data that about 170 minutes per week or 25 minutes per day of moderate physical activity had a 5 to 6% improvement in FV1. So I thought that was really good. Because for the first time, that's not published yet, it's going to be coming out in the next couple of months. But for the first time, we know what dose response is. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't be doing your 60 minutes a day. What I'm saying is the minimum requirement to really see improvement was about 25, which is great. Now, with all studies, I sort of get myself all tied up in this one, because with all studies, you have to proceed with caution, right? So imagine if a study came out that told you that the more exercise you did, the worse you got. I mean, that's a bit scary, isn't it? And that's exactly what this study did. So there's a study that has recently come out that has caused a lot of shocking face emojis among physios across Ireland, the UK and Europe, which was a study by Helge Hipstraat, who I really like, from the Netherlands. It's called the Activate CF. And if you see the bit highlighted there, they recruited 117 patients. And after 6 months, the FV1 was significantly higher in the group that didn't exercise than the group that had a supervised conditioning program. So that's a little bit scary, isn't it? And I think there was a lot of fear, which then led to an editorial that was written, which I'll show you now in a second, which was, can exercise make our patients worse? And I think what's really important is that you don't always take what you read at face value. So you went back over, and I spoke to Helga about this study in a meeting a couple of weeks ago, and I wondered that the intensity at which they required these patients to do the strength program, did they suddenly stop doing their physio? And he couldn't tell me the data. So did all this participation in a study require them to drop a little bit of their airway clearance, which may have resulted in lung function? We don't have the answer to that. The other thing I think is really important when you read studies like this is you dig a little deeper. We realize that he intended to recruit, I can't remember how many patients, but what he actually managed was only 40% of the target population. So what you have to ask yourself when you read a study like this is, are those that sign up to this kind of trial tend to be people who don't mind which group they're assigned to? And therefore the voice of those who do mind is lost, and the impact of their choice is lost to clinical care. So when you're randomized into a trial where you're going to have to do heaps of exercise, if you're not inclined to do heaps of exercise, you probably won't sign up to that trial, but may actually be benefiting from lots of exercise more than the people who did sign up for it. And therefore, your clinical voice, the voice of your clinical outcome, is lost. I think sometimes when we look at studies like this that hadn't an outcome that we expected, we may have to think a little bit longer about how you recruit and how you recruit fairly to represent the population. Some people with cystic fibrosis are already making their healthcare choices, which is absolutely right. And their outcomes, therefore, in research are lost too. They've made a decision not to do something, and then they participate in a study. You may not actually see the outcome. For instance, a lot of the James Lind Alliance and a lot of what I talk about in clinic is whether airway clearance exercise can replace airway clearance in cystic fibrosis. That really gives me the shock face emoji. I just think, oh my goodness, we don't have any evidence to say that this is effective or appropriate to start dropping your physio. But we know in this study here that the one on the right hand side is that patients are already doing that. So in the study done by Rowbotham here, that 54% of patients surveyed were doing exercise and airway clearance, but 48% of those patients omitted their airway clearance on days that they exercised. Now, we've no evidence to say whether it's going to work or not, and that is being looked at in the UK. It's a feasibility study underway by Zoe Sinner and Dawn Urquhart in Edinburgh. And again, you have to think a little bit about the people they recruit to that study. Like if you're in a study where you're told not to do airway clearance, if you're very attached to your airway clearance, you're not likely to sign up for that one, are you? So I'm looking forward to seeing the results of that feasibility study, but I think it's a really difficult question to answer, and a really difficult question to answer fairly. So moving on from that, we just have to be careful about how we interpret some of the researchers out there. So what are the barriers to exercise in cystic fibrosis, and to come away from cystic fibrosis, to come into what are the barriers to exercising in all populations? Because according to Eleanor Main, it was about most of the patients were achieving, but less than half of what they should have been achieving. And then I thought about the fantastic DCU trial, which I'm sure you've heard about, in December, was published in December 2020. It's here by Stephen Behan, and it looked at it was called the Moving Well, Being Well project for DCU, and explored the relationship between fundamental movement skills and health-related fitness components. And fundamental movement skills. It was a sample of 2,098 children across all social areas in Ireland, DEIS schools, non-DEIS schools, all the rest, ages 5 to 12. And they looked at the fundamental skills of running, jumping, skipping, hopping, and how they contribute to overall healthcare outcomes. And these fundamental movement skills, they are something you need to achieve by the age of 8. And they plateau achievement at 10. But if you haven't achieved them by 8, then it has a serious consequence, and you can't achieve them after that, and has a serious consequence then in your later life sporting participation. And what this study showed us is that 17% of primary school children age were not engaging in 1 hour of activity a day, and we could have guessed that even from the Eleanor Mayer trial, but that 60% had a mastery of balance. That's 40% of kids couldn't stand on one leg. 52% of kids had adequate locomotor skills. That left another 48% without them, and 54% of patients or kids in this study had object control skills, which is kicking a ball, and that left another 56% or 46% that didn't. So we have to ask ourselves, by not getting our kids to participate in sport, we're setting them up to fail, but to fail in the future. And I think that was really interesting. It was really interesting to me as a mum. And if our children aren't achieving this, how do we address this impact? And I think I'll talk a little bit about that again. The other big problem area in people with cystic fibrosis in other area is adolescent girls. And this slide shows you that teenage girls, once they hit age 12, just stop exercising. And we don't entirely know why. And we had the Sports Ireland have looked at this in a big research paper in 2021. And they looked at the barriers. And when I looked at the barriers in that, I realized that they're the same barriers for people with cystic fibrosis. They were exactly the same. And it's all about this concept of how you influence exercise behavior depends on their capacity, their motivation, and their opportunity. And how do we change those things? But capacity is things like you identify. So do you identify yourself as a sporty person or not a sporty person? And if you don't identify as a sporty person, then your capacity to exercise is reduced, and that therefore influence your exercise behavior. Your motivation is also a big problem with cystic fibrosis, in that often too tired, too busy, too many other things to do, or too many other treatments to do. Teenage girls are often are too busy with school, perhaps, and maybe that's why the motivation isn't there to exercise. But how we can change that, and then finally the opportunity. They wrap it up in teenage girls into things like fear of ridicule, too much homework leading to less time, and also nothing that they enjoy doing. And I've heard all of those things in clinic as well. So our ability to change our exercise behavior is very complex and influenced. And when we reflect upon this, how do we as healthcare professionals, but how do we as families, how do we as friends, how do we as parents influence each one of these, and how do we change that? Well, they looked at how they changed them, and I think if you were to ask now as a poll, how would you change it? All of these ideas would come up, but you've heard them all before. But I think it's worth reminding: focus on fun. When exercise, whether you're an adult or a child, it has to be fun. It has to be something you want to do. If you're not a competitive personality, then don't make it a competition. Don't put them into really competitive sports if that's not what's anything. And what I find myself having a daughter is that she's not sporty, but she loves to dance, and I think dancing is such a good exercise and really needs to be acknowledged more when it comes to sport funding. And that's another day. Exciting. It should be social, and especially for teenage girls, but especially for us as adults. Walking with friends, it keeps you going. Smaller groups, if you're worried about your identity around sport, you don't identify with being sporty, maybe a smaller group of people is going to be easier. Different, try everything. Keep going, try something different. If you're not into team sports, try something that's one-on-one, tennis, badminton, volleyball, try something as gymnastics was not a big hit in my house, but trying everything. Making sure you get entered at the right level. Don't go in at something that's too high and then you don't achieve and then you get frustrated. And then role modeling. I'll go into a bit about that at the end. I think role modeling, we all have a role in role modeling, and I think it's so important. So when you're in clinic, I'll always talk about those things. We talk about finding out what you like, making it accessible. The CF Association do great funding with their exercise grants. But I often tell patients it doesn't have to be about a gym. A gym is 45 minutes away that you're not going to drive to, or it's going to be too difficult to get there. Or gyms, believe it or not, are intimidating environments for some people, and I find that surprising. One day when a patient discussed that with me, and it never occurred to me. But going in there, not knowing how to use the machine, that's a big problem. And then not knowing to look like you didn't know how to use the machines, a big problem. I had to Google how to use squat rack once because I didn't know how to use it myself. I didn't want to look like an idiot when I went into the gym. So these are barriers. Taking small steps, bite-sized chunks, but no more. Build slowly and consistently and repeat. And I think that came through in the research. I'm going to say it again, that one of my pet peeves is inconsistency around exercise, and then not achieving results leaves a frustration, which then reduces compliance. So unfortunately, when it comes to exercise, it's doing the same thing repeatedly, again and again and again, and then you will see a result. It might not be very exciting most weeks, but you will see a result if you keep going back and doing it again. So coming back to the first slide I showed, this is my last slide, you get to see me again, sorry about that, but I want you to think about what you don't see in this. So I wasn't a lifelong exerciser. My parents couldn't drive me to sports as a child. I did dance and I loved it. And I didn't enjoy team sports, and I never engaged in team sports. However, I did find my niche for martial arts. And I had a really strong role modeling from my parents. My father was one of those 80s marathon runners, tight on the runners, ran out. Athletics was everything in my house. I have lifelong friends who are allergic to exercise. You probably think all my friends love exercise, but these guys in the bottom left-hand corner hate it. They've never exercised, but they put up with my quirkiness, especially when my marathon running clashed with their birthday every single year. But I was never excluded and I was never ridiculed. And that was really important because I was tolerated and my quirkiness was tolerated. I had lots of training buddies. And when you train long distance, these guys were everything to me. They sat on the bike with me for 6 hours on Sunday. I am still terrified of open water, absolutely terrified of open water. But they talked me into my toes into the water at the start of every single race that I did. And I have to really thank them for that. And they helped me maintain my exercise behaviours in doing that. But they all are mums now and dads now, and they've all their priorities have changed, but we all still exercise, but probably not to the intensity we did before. What you also see here is the pressures of being married to an elite athlete. I mean, his exercise is always going to be more important than mine, but it's not. And he really respects the need for women to exercise, for women to role model as exercisers, and for me to participate in sport. And I have to say, I probably, in my past, have had unhealthy relationships with exercise and perfectionism, and I had to work through those too. So lots of things you'll see aren't necessarily what's apparent. I had 2 pregnancies, which I exercised through. So if you're pregnant with cystic fibrosis, I know what the barriers are there. I know what it's like to return to exercise after pregnancy, but I also know what the barriers is to try to drive a 7-year-old daughter to GE every week, which she doesn't want to do it, and there's tears, and I'm trying to get her to engage in sport in 60 minutes a day. It does seem at times unachievable. So there's lots of barriers, there's lots that we can do to role model as a friend, parent, a sibling, and I hope there's be loads of questions afterwards. And if you can think of anything to ask me, I'm more than happy to take all the questions I can. I think I've gone over. Thank you very much.
Super, thanks so much, Claire. Some great tips and great insights for lots of people, and obviously the studies, interesting to see both perspectives in relation to this, but I think fundamentally the message is exercise is good. We need to be consistent. We need to make those consistent incremental gains. And yeah, if you could stay on the panel, that'd be great, obviously, because we've got Chris and then Caroline as well. And what we're going to do is wrap it up with the Q&A towards the end.